Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, the Associate Dean for Liberal Arts History Programs at Southern New Hampshire University's Global Campus. Today I'm talking to Shannon Lange, a curator for Blocks to Bricks, a museum dedicated to construction toys in Schaumburg, Illinois. Shannon is also a recent graduate of the SNHU Graduate History Program with the Public History concentration. In this episode, we're going to discuss her academic and professional background and her career trajectory so far. What is your name and what do you do?
My name is Shannon Lange, and I'm a curator at Blocks to Bricks Museum.
That's great. It sounds like a really interesting museum, and I'm looking forward to talking about that. Before we get there, though, can you talk a little bit about your academic and professional background? How did you become curator of this place, and what was your training?
So, sort of longish story. I started at Iowa State and then transferred to Southern New Hampshire University, and I got my bachelor's in Middle Eastern History in 2016, and took a whole month off and jumped straight into the MA program at SNHU and graduated 2017. Did a couple of small internship things with local history center and at the Field Museum before I started as museum educator and camp director at a small museum in February of 2018, and then was recently just hired for this curator job.
So when you were in school, it sounds like you must have been a public history major, or public history concentration, I mean?
For my master's, yeah.
Okay. What was your capstone project on in that?
I wrote about and designed an exhibit tour program about Chicago shipwrecks and how those shipwrecks started to influence maritime law.
Oh, okay, great. That sounds really interesting. And so you are now working in the museum field, and that's great to hear that you got into the museum field fairly quickly after graduation, it sounds like. So you said that you are curator for Blocks to Bricks. So what does a day in your life look like as a curator?
I'm still working on figuring that out since it's a new position, but it's a mixture of retail things since it is a museum located inside a shopping mall, but I'll also be responsible for doing grant work, helping build and design new exhibits, helping maintain the current exhibits, and generally improving the status of the museum since it's now a nonprofit.
And you said it's located inside a shopping mall. That's an interesting place to have a museum. Is this a conscious decision to try to engage with a broader public, or is it just circumstances, or how did that come about?
From what I've been told, I haven't spent too much time working with the owner just yet. He was wanting to do it inside a shopping mall so that it would be more accessible to everyone and it wouldn't necessarily have to be your set destination because it is a small space. So he understands that people don't necessarily want to go somewhere that they're going to spend an hour and then leave. So this way they can take a break from shopping, go look at stuff, continue shopping.
And what types of exhibits does this museum hold?
It's entirely dedicated to the history of building toys, ranging of all sorts of different materials, like stone, wood, of course plastic, and a variety of age range. So there's things from the late 1800s, early 1900s through stuff made last year.
Legos, I imagine?
Legos, Connects, Lincoln Logs, Erector sets, a little bit of everything.
Oh my God, the 8-year-old me is so jealous of you right now. That sounds really cool. We've got there's a Lego store, but there's also one of those Lego Discovery, I forget what it's called, Discovery Island or something. It's in one of the malls here in Columbus, and it has something like 20,000 square feet of just Legos to just go nuts with. It's nothing like what you have, I'm sure, but I was a Lego geek as a kid. I'm still a Lego geek, and my son is a Lego geek, thankfully, so I have an excuse. But man, that's really cool. That sounds really cool, anyway. And so before this point, you said that you were working at a heritage center. What did you do there?
I was their museum educator and camp director, where I was in charge of planning and mostly executing any program that the museum could hold, whether it be a craft day where we teach you how to do some form of cultural or historically significant craft, or general education programs, or homeschool classes, or scout programs, and then planning and running the 5 weeks of history-themed summer camp.
And so for these positions, what was the hiring process like? So I'm just kind of stepping back to when you first graduated from your MA history program. How did you start searching for jobs, and what was the application process like? And if you could just walk us through, if someone's basically, I'm trying to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody graduating an MA program, how do they start to find these jobs like the ones you found?
So for the Skokie Heritage Museum, I got lots of emails from AASLH, which is American Alliance of State and Local History, I think. Something to that effect.
Sounds right.
And they would send lots of emails for different job listings, and I was looking primarily for around Chicago area since that's where I'm at, and it made more sense to find something here than try and move, at least right away. And this educator job came up, and I applied for it. Forgot I applied because I hadn't heard anything for a few months, and then got an email around the holidays in 2017, and then interviewed twice, and they actually gave me sort of a test as part of that interview process, where I had to meet certain recommendations of finding field trip ideas for summer camp for the 11 to 14-year-olds that are within like a 45-minute drive of the museum, and then come up with activities for homeschool classes that fit certain topics, which I forget offhand. And for the curator job, that one is actually pure dumb luck. I went through the museum with one of my friends, and when he paid for tickets, he noticed that they had a hiring sign. And so after we left and realized that it was really cool, he was like, you should apply to this and work here, and then you can spend all of your time playing with all these toys. And so I sent them an email saying, hey, I've got a master's in know how to work in a museum. Can I work for you? And did an interview with the manager, waited like a week, heard back. They did a second interview with the owner, and they made an offer then and there. So it was a little backwards from what I've gotten used to for applying and getting interviews.
Right. Getting the interview is kind of the hardest part in academia and kind of related fields, like a lot of history fields too. That's really great. So in this position, now it sounds like this is a fairly small institution, as you've been saying, but is it going to be, is it just you and the manager and the owner, or do you have a staff that's going to be working with you? What is the workforce like at this institution?
I've only actually been doing work there for like 2 days as of now, since I was just offered right after Christmas and then the holidays happened.
Fair enough.
But from my understanding, there's the owner, the manager, and myself will be doing the majority of the museum-related tasks. And then there's 3 or 4 other people, I think, that handle the more retail storefront side of it. And he wants to eventually have me do more and more behind the scenes, less people-facing, so that the museum itself can grow and be better. But a staff of maybe like 5 or 6 people. Again,
putting ourselves in kind of the shoes of somebody that's coming out of a graduate or even an undergraduate history program, based on your experiences so far, what do you think students should do? It sounds like it worked really well for you to join the AASLH, whatever that stands for, state and local history, and then you just were basically just kind of keeping an eye on any job listings that were posted there. Do you have any other suggestions for folks that are looking for a new career in this type of field?
The big thing that I've been doing that I've found was at least most useful was just watching the job boards in different organizations and signing up for as many of those organizations as I could afford, and just kind of creatively searching for jobs under every search term I could come up with relating to a museum job. So I was searching like archivist, curator, assistant to both of those, educator, anything that I could come up with that was tangentially related.
Yeah, okay. Well, that makes sense. What is your ultimate goal? So you're a curator, which is that's a big deal. So are you in the future, is this the kind of the line you want to go in, or do you eventually hope to go into a different kind of branch of public history? What do you hope to do going forward?
At this point, I'm not really sure. My whole thing since I was in like middle school was that I wanted to be a curator at a museum. So now that I'm there, I'm not really sure what the next thing would be. I hadn't
Okay.
thought that I would actually get that after graduation, knowing that
Right.
history is kind of a scary field for actually working.
Right. No, and that's fine. That's I mean, you're just starting out, so no, it's perfectly fine. That's one of those job interview type title or questions you always dread hearing. So where do you see yourself in 5 years? You're like, well, hopefully working, but all right, well that's great. So I'm really glad to hear that this is working out for you and that you've found a good fit and that you've found something in your area. That's really helpful too. A lot of people, because of the arbitrary nature of working in history-related fields, a lot of people end up having to move away to go find a job. That's really great to hear that you were able to find the one that was close to home, so you didn't have to completely uproot your life for this. Do you have anything that you would like to recommend to us all here today?
The biggest thing that I learned while I was in school and like right after I graduated, because there was almost 6 months between finding the museum educator job from when I graduated, that I did start to get kind of disheartened by it and afraid that I wouldn't find anything. But then I just kind of kept pushing at it because I knew I worked so hard to get my degree, I might as well keep trying and just force myself to stay persistent, even though I was getting a little bummed out about not finding things as quickly as I wanted.
Yeah, that's one of the hardest lessons, I think, is to just keep at it, because it's a hard field to break into, and sometimes you get lucky, oftentimes you don't, and it is full of rejection, and you can only survive and keep moving forward if you maintain a kind of a positive attitude and convince yourself to just keep trying, because it's really easy to get disheartened. In this field, a lot of people want to be in the history field because there is a huge percentage of the population that likes being part of history, but there aren't as many job openings as there are interested people, and so it is always a challenge to get into the field, and so it does take a lot of persistence. It takes a lot of stubbornness, if you want to call it that. You have to just keep going and keep trying, and in spite of all the rejections, and eventually, hopefully, you'll find something that works. And then even if you find something that doesn't really work, it's at least hopefully you can use that as a stepping stone for something else that does work better later on, that kind of thing. Did you have any last thoughts on your career that might be interesting to people that are listening in?
I've gotten to actually go to a couple of conferences while I was working as the museum educator that they actually paid for, which was really nice.
Yeah.
They were conferences in the Chicago area, so I didn't have to deal with the travel stress. But those were, at least the one this past weekend was American Historical Association conference, and that was probably one of the strangest things that I've been to, and that since it was historians, it was, of course, all people that love history, but it was more exclusively academic historians. So I found myself trying to have conversations with people that are working on their doctorate or teach 6 classes at a time, as opposed to working with people and developing programs for museums and stuff like that, which was its own bizarre creature.
Yeah, the AAH conferences, they are strange. It's huge. There's thousands of people wandering around, and there's dozens of panels going at any one time. It is kind of overwhelming. I mean, I haven't been there in a few years. I need to get going back to those again, but it is huge. And the first time I went was when I was actually still in graduate school, and I was just wrapping up my MA degree, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with the degree, and so I went to the AAH conference hoping that might give me some ideas. And I was just overwhelmed, and I just felt lost the whole time. And when I left, I had no idea, still had no idea what I wanted to do, because there were people, like you said, I was mainly talking to people that were already PhDs or were in PhD programs. They were already published. They were presenting papers. Or the other people that I tended to run into were the people that were there for job interviews, which had that whole side of it, I forget what they call it. Was it the job? job farm, or oh shoot, I forget what they call it, but they have a whole wing of the hotel with like rooms reserved for people to do interviews for
Yeah.
academic jobs and all of that. And so on the one hand, you had all of these people that were already established historians, and then you've also got all the grad students, and then you also have all the job applicants who, of course, have this kind of air of desperation and despair and terror because they were going to be interviewing with people. And so it was just it is a very weird mix of people. You don't tend to have that same type of mix at some of the smaller conferences.
Mm-hmm.
It's just AHA being it's the AHA, of course. So it's the worldwide premier history organization. So I guess of course that meeting is going to be chaotic, but it is quite a production, and it is something that I recommend everyone do it at least once in their life, just to get a sense of what, it's like the Disneyland of the history profession or something, where you just get to see all historians of all shapes, sizes, and status all in one place,
Yeah.
interacting and bumping into each other, and some people drinking and all of that. So it's
Yes.
a really interesting experience. I'm glad you went to it, because it's quite a sight.
It was definitely interesting given that with current situation with the whole shutdown, that there was actually a lot of people that were supposed to be there either presenting or recruiting that couldn't be because they weren't allowed to actually travel. There was supposed to be a bunch of people from like the Smithsonian that just couldn't, so they had to find some other way to get someone else that wasn't affiliated to present their work for them, which was
Oh wow.
a bizarre and clearly uncomfortable for everyone situation.
Oh yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. That would be crazy. Well, good. So overall, would you recommend it to people? I mean, I just did, obviously, but do you think it's worthwhile for folks in your profession to pursue, or should they be focusing more on public history type organizations?
It's definitely something worthwhile because they did have some things dedicated to people in public history and even more specifically the museum track, though some of the museum things are geared more towards bigger places. So that's something to kind of take and look at and see if it can be twisted into a smaller museum setting. But otherwise, you at least meet some really interesting people. And I got to talk with some other students that are actually working on their MA in public history at a reception that they hosted.
Now that you mentioned that, I think the year that I went there, I think the AHA held their meeting in conjunction with the Public History Group. What is it? National Council of Public Historians, I think it is. I think they held their conference at the same time, so there was actually a much more larger, probably the normal percentage of public historians there. But they don't do that every year. I think this year it was in conjunction with the MLA or something.
Yep.
Yeah, so there are some years where they combine them both into one mega thing between like academic historians and public historians, and that I can just imagine would be like this perfect storm that would just lay a city to waste or something under the weight of historians.
Right.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you went. I'm glad you had at least sounds like you had an interesting time at least.
Yes.
You do make a good point that the larger museum organizations are probably a bit overrepresented at places like this. The smaller ones probably often can't afford to send representatives, and so smaller operations probably tend to be underrepresented at those places. And so it's good to hear that you were able to go. Was it actually it was actually in Chicago this year, right?
Yeah, so I was able to just travel from home and not have to pay for a hotel or flights or anything
Excellent.
more costly.
Great. Well, I'm going to recommend a book called The Last Full Measure: How Soldiers Die in Battle by Michael Stevenson. I'm not a military historian, but this one kind of jumped out at me because it is the story not of necessarily of military history, but it's just about how soldiers have died in battle, like what actually killed them on the battlefield. It's not a traditional military history in that it's not talking about, troop movements or this unit moving over there in support of that unit. None of that stuff. It's just about when the soldiers die, how do they die? And so it talks about basically going back to the beginning of human history. How did humans die? So the first couple of chapters are all about how getting stabbed, getting hit by rocks, getting smacked by spears, and then it would talk about getting, during the medieval period, how armor might protect you, but it also might not. And then when you get into the Civil War and the World War I, we start to get to more mechanized weaponry and all that. It just talks about how, how bullets kill people, and how often do people die from things like artillery blasts versus rifle blasts versus bombs. And so it's just a really interesting story about how people actually died. One of the interesting parts to it, to me anyway, is that it tries to represent, the generals whose names we all know, but it also tries to talk about all of the thousands of foot soldiers who died that are never named in the battles. And so it talks a lot about how, so you'd have 10,000 people getting mowed down by machine gun or whatever, and then it talks about what happens to those people afterward. Most of them get buried in a mass grave, or the artillery continues to shell the bodies and just to completely obliterate them over time. So it's interesting that it talks about the foot soldier, the infantrymen, whatever you want to call them, and the generals, because military history, when we hear about things like the Civil War and all that, we always make a big deal about hearing about, General Stonewall Jackson died in this battle, and so it was such a sad event and all that, but we don't know the names of the other 20,000 people that died at that battle. And so this book doesn't go through and name all those 20,000 people, but it tries to kind of talk about what did those 20,000 guys face when they were charging into battle and all that. So it kind of traces okay, you get the order, you start running, this is what's going to happen to you. You run, 30 yards, and then you start getting hit by artillery fire. And then you run the next 30 yards, you start getting hit by rifle fire. And so it just talks about kind of the experience that the guys on the ground faced in these conflicts throughout human history, and it makes for a really interesting read. It's a sad read because, oh my God, people died in such horrible ways. And it's also not just the people that died. It also talks about, the number of wounded. X percentage of soldiers left the battlefield with amputations, that kind of thing, to give you a sense of how. And of course, most people that got amputations, they died later anyway. Most wounds lead to death. So it's all kind of tied together. But anyway, it's an interesting book. It's a way to tell interesting military history for those of us that are not military historians, who don't want to get bogged down in troop movements and all of that. So thank you, Shannon, for joining us today. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is great.
And thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments on this podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please send me an email, like always, to workinghistorians@gmail.com. For Shannon Lange, I am Rob Denning. See you in 2 weeks.